They did not come to erase the human species. They came to erase what the species remembered about itself. The Cerulean Compact called it archive normalization. Earth servers went dark in 14 minutes. Every ministry record, every newspaper archive, every court transcript, every grainy home video uploaded since the first camera phone. The Compact's official notice, translated by their own linguists into flawless English, described the deletion as a courtesy correction to a species-wide documentation error, performed at no cost to the beneficiary. Humanity had apparently been keeping the wrong kind of history, too much war, too much shame, too much evidence of a species that could not be trusted to curate its own past. The notice itself ran to 4 paragraphs of dense administrative prose, and it took Earth's translators less than an hour to render it into something almost comically bureaucratic. This normalization proceeds under Cultural Correction Statute 4, subsection deletions of record, and constitutes no treaty obligation, no compensation, and no right of appeal, as the material in question was assessed to hold negative documentary value. Negative documentary value. An entire species of court records, family photographs, and half-finished novels filed under a category that suggested it would have been better if none of it had ever existed. The notice arrived with a smiling attachment. Archivate Provost Denari Kessin, a compact cultural officer with the posture of a man who had never once been contradicted, addressed the planet in a recorded statement, speaking in an English so precise it had clearly been rehearsed for exactly this occasion. He wore the expression of someone doing you a favor. In 3 centuries, he said, you will thank us for the clean slate. He did not raise his voice, he did not need to. Somewhere behind him, on a screen no human viewer could read, 400 years of digitized record already sat empty, and he gestured toward it the way a man gestures toward a room he has just tidied. For 6 hours, the planet was silent in a way it had never been silent before. Newsrooms with nothing left to report sat dark. Search engines returned empty result pages for queries that had worked perfectly the day before. Then one woman picked up a phone that no longer had anything to search and made a call that did not require the internet to work. Dr. Amara Voss had spent 11 years being quietly ridiculed for a project nobody thought was necessary. She ran a nonprofit called the Continuity Project out of a converted printing warehouse in Ljubljana, and its entire purpose, as her critics loved to point out at conferences, was to prepare for a digital apocalypse that was never going to happen. She had recruited monks, actuaries, retired schoolteachers, and one extremely stubborn ham radio operator and taught them over a decade to memorize things, not symbolically, literally, entire trial transcripts, entire censuses, entire runs of local newspapers, rendered into verse and mnemonic chains and handed down like scripture, because paper burned and drives corrupted and someone somewhere needed a version of events that did not live in a place that could be switched off. She had been called paranoid in 4 languages. She had been defunded twice, once by a board member who told her, not unkindly, that she was building a lifeboat for a ship that was never going to sink. Her marriage had not survived the second round of funding hearings, and she kept that fact in the same drawer where she kept everything else she had decided not to think about during business hours. She had learned over 11 years to stop explaining herself to people who would only understand the explanation in hindsight. When the servers went dark, Voss did not check the news. She had known in the abstract, unspecific way that people know about earthquakes and house fires, that this day was coming, and the knowledge had cost her more than anyone in her life had ever been told. She called a monastery in Slovenia and asked whether Brother Anton still remembered the 1948 census by heart. He did. She asked next about the 1963 court transcripts and the coastal registry from before the flood maps changed, and he answered each question in the calm, unhurried voice of a man who had spent 30 years turning paperwork into prayer. She said one sentence into the phone, the sentence that would end up 18 months later engraved above the door of the rebuilt National Archive. They stripped what they thought was the only copy. I'm interested in everything else. While the compact had assumed information lived in one place. That assumption was the mistake, and it took the Continuity Project 11 days to prove it, one specialist at a time, in 3 cities that had never coordinated with each other until Voss gave them a reason to. In a converted cathedral basement in Krakow, cryptographer Idris Bonsu, no relation to the actor, a coincidence he had stopped correcting people about around the 3rd year of being asked, had spent 4 years insisting, to an audience of exactly nobody, that oral tradition was a form of distributed storage with better fault tolerance than any server farm ever built. His papers had been rejected from 3 journals with the same phrase in the margins each time, thermodynamically implausible as a storage medium at scale. He went quiet in the archive's back room because the recovery logs told him, in the space of 9 seconds, that 4 years of ridicule had been 4 years of being correct. He sat down on the cold stone floor because his legs had stopped agreeing to hold him up. "This isn't a backup," he said, once he could speak again. "This is 9,000 independent nodes, and every one of them is a person who can't be subpoenaed, hacked, or deleted." He had built a compression schema years earlier, a way of folding dense legal and historical data into memorizable rhyme and rhythm, the kind a person could carry the way they carried a childhood song, and had been mocked for it in 3 separate peer reviews. It was, it turned out, the only format the Compact's deletion protocol had never thought to search for, because it did not look like data. It looked like a grandmother reciting a poem to a bored teenager on a train. In Manila, linguist Priya Anand, mistaken exactly once for the singer of the same name, and never again after the look she gave the intern who asked, mapped something stranger. Voss's project had quietly rebuilt a printing guild network across 9 cities over 6 years, funded through a patchwork of grants nobody had bothered to scrutinize because nobody thought paper mattered anymore. Each guild held a partial physical ink on paper copy of a different decade of recovered material. No guild held the whole record. Every guild held enough. Anand went still over a ledger of shipping manifests because the pattern in front of her only worked if someone had designed it that way on purpose, years before there was any reason to. "They deleted the map," she said, setting the ledger down carefully as if it might still be fragile. "They didn't delete the territory." The third discovery was the one that changed the shape of the war. Retired signals engineer Jonah Park, forcibly retired from 3 separate space agencies for the crime of being right roughly a decade before anyone wanted him to be, found something buried in the structure of the Compact's own deletion broadcast. The wipe signal had been layered over the Compact's standard planetary relay network, the same infrastructure they used for diplomatic transmissions, running on the same 11 frequency band. Encrypted with a rotating key, the Compact had not updated in 6 years, because they had never expected anyone on the receiving end to be listening that closely. Park stared at the packet structure for 11 minutes without speaking, because the sentence forming in his head required him to be certain before he said it out loud. He had spent a career being told his obsession with legacy protocols was a waste of institutional time. He did not gloat now. He simply said quietly to no one in particular, "They didn't bring a weapon, they brought a courier. And a courier can carry anything you hand it." Voss listened to all 3 reports in the same afternoon, standing in a warehouse that smelled of ink and old paper, and understood before anyone else in the room did that the Compact had not made one mistake. It had made the same mistake 3 times, in 3 different disciplines, because it had never once imagined that a species it considered primitive might have already built the correction before the insult arrived. The Compact discovered the reconstruction on day 14. When a compact linguistic survey flagged 9 independent human networks broadcasting synchronized historical data on a frequency the deletion protocol was supposed to own outright. Archivate Provost Kessen's response arrived within the hour, and it was not written by the smiling man from the recording. It was written the way a species writes when it has been embarrassed in front of its superiors. Unauthorized duplication of normalized material constitutes a breach of the correction accord. You are given 40 hours to surrender all recovered archives for renormalization. Noncompliance will result in the physical decommissioning of all broadcast infrastructure identified as hosting the violation. This is not a negotiation. The last line was the only part of the message that was not written in careful diplomatic language, and that was how Voss knew it had been added personally, by someone who was angrier than the rest of the document allowed him to sound. Voss read it twice because the second read was to check her own reaction rather than the message itself. She did not look afraid. She looked like a woman checking her watch. Around her, the warehouse had gone quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when everyone in them is waiting to be told whether to be frightened. She let the silence sit for exactly as long as it took to finish reading, then closed the message. 40 hours, she said, is 39 more than we need. Park wanted 8 hours to test the counterpacket properly. Bonsu wanted 12. Anand wanted to know what happened to the guilds if the plan failed. Voss gave them all the same answer, which was not reassurance so much as arithmetic. They had already rebuilt a civilization's memory out of nothing once, in secret over 11 years with no deadline at all. 40 hours, by comparison, was luxurious. The compact fleet arrived over 9 cities at the exact moment the deadline expired. 11 decommissioning corvettes, each carrying 3 directed EMP drones tuned to a single frequency, descending on relay towers from an altitude of 40 kilometers at a closing speed of just under 600 meters per second. 33 drones in total. 6 minutes and 40 seconds from first descent to final retreat. No human aircraft rose to meet them because the fight had never been going to happen in the air. 90 seconds before impact over Krakow, Park's team pushed a counter-packet up the Compact's own courier channel. The same channel the original deletion signal had ridden in on, using the same 6-year-old key. It did not attack the drones. It told them in their own command syntax that their mission had already been completed. 22 drones stood down mid-descent and returned to orbit, their kill order marked fulfilled by their own command architecture. It was the cleanest kind of victory. A war ended by paperwork, the way the Compact itself had once tried to end a civilization. The remaining 11 adapted faster than any human simulation had predicted. Their operators, realizing the signal had been spoofed, switched to manual targeting in under 20 seconds and put 4 direct hits into the Krakow relay array, stripping 40% of its transmission capacity in a single pass. Annan's team rerouted the broadcast through the Manila Guild network without a pause in the signal. The record did not stop. It changed address. One corvette broke formation at the 90-second mark and began a slow climb toward the upper atmosphere without firing a shot. Voss let it go. It came to watch, not to fight, she said later. You don't shoot the witness. You want them to report exactly what they saw. By the time the 11 surviving drones finished their manual pass over Krakow, the relay array had already handed its transmission roll to Manila mid-broadcast, and the recording that later circulated showed no gap in the signal at all, only a brief flicker where the timestamp changed origin cities. It was, Bonsu said afterward, the least dramatic battle footage anyone would ever watch twice. The engagement ended with 0 human casualties, 4 damaged relay arrays already rerouted around, and 1 compact fleet commander whose after-action report would later describe the incident, with visible discomfort, as a logistics failure of unprecedented character. Kessen's official transmission arrived 9 hours later, full of the same bureaucratic ice as before, a formal acknowledgement that the correction accord would require review. The private message came a day after that, unlisted, sent from a personal terminal instead of a diplomatic one. There was a long silence before he spoke. 9 full seconds, which for a species like his was closer to a full minute. I assumed, he said finally, that a species without central storage was a species without memory. I did not account for the possibility that you had simply put your memory somewhere I would never think to look. It was audacious. I was wrong about the specific mechanism, and I suspect I was wrong about more than that. Voss read the message once, standing in the same warehouse she had been quietly mocked in for 11 years, and let herself feel, for exactly as long as it took to read it, every defunding meeting and every empty chair at every conference panel she had ever sat on alone. Then she closed the message and did not open it again. She sent her reply the following morning, full access to the Compact's own historical archive, the one they kept of every species they had ever corrected, in exchange for humanity's silence on the incident, and a standing agreement that no future normalization would proceed without human archival consent. It was not a treaty born of anger. It was a trade, the kind Voss had been negotiating in miniature for 11 years with skeptical funding boards, except now the currency was the memory of 100 vanished civilizations instead of a grant renewal. She did not celebrate when Kessen's office accepted it without amendment. She simply added the incoming archive to a spreadsheet she had been keeping since long before anyone believed she would ever need it. Bonsu found her at 2 in the morning, still awake, cross-referencing the first archive delivery against Park's compression schema, building a second layer of redundancy before anyone had even finished celebrating the first. You're already doing it again, he said. It was not a question. They kept records of every species they erased, Voss said, not looking up because looking up would have meant stopping. Somebody has to make sure this is the last time anyone has to memorize a whole civilization just to keep it alive. By the end of the week, she had already started teaching the schema to a new class of 12-year-olds in Ljubljana, on the theory that the next deletion, whoever it came from, would not wait for the world to be ready a second time. Park framed the 11-frequency packet log and hung it in his workshop, next to 3 rejection letters he had never thrown away. Anand went back to Manila and added a 10th guild to the network, because 9 had worked and 10 was safer. Bonsu published, finally, in a journal that had rejected him twice before, and included in the acknowledgments a single line that named no one and thanked everyone, for the ones who kept it in their heads when there was nowhere else to keep it. None of them called it a victory. Voss, in particular, avoided the word entirely because a victory implied an ending, and she had spent 11 years learning exactly how expensive endings could be to believe in. What she had instead was a longer list, a larger network, and a 12-year-old in the front row of her Ljubljana classroom who memorized the entire recovery timeline in one sitting and asked, without being prompted, what came next. The next thing, Voss told her, is that we make sure this was the last time anyone had to ask that question in a panic. Ask that question in a panic.